Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Major indications as to what changes Ferrari are going to bring for their car for the Austrian Grand Prix weekend. A major floor change expected on the way. Yes, it's only one component. Some would say this is more of a minor upgrade, but the sources say no. This is a major indication of the direction they're looking to take with their car, and if this doesn't improve the performance of the SO25, they are basically cooked for the rest of the season. A massively important weekend for Ferrari to set them up for what they still think is possible to achieve with this year's car. Hamilton says, guys, can't we just focus on next year at this point? Very much on Twitter, your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Plenty to get into. We're going to start here. Valtteri Bottas yesterday put this video out. We talked about it in the video talking about Cadillac. Now, whether he's like soft launching the join, whether it's just a troll or whatever, you know, either which would kind of be on brand for Bottas in this new version of Bottas that it's been pretty nice to see since he departed Mercedes. Now, Cadillac Bottas to me makes rather a lot of sense. He's got the mustache. He's got the mullet. You know, the Americans would love it, right? Like, there's a lot of things that this maybe makes sense on, and we're now hearing today that because Bottas is still so heavily involved in Formula 1, he has actually reached #1 status among Cadillac in terms of who they're going to sign for next year. So the big talk was over the last, let's say, month or so, that Perez was very close to getting that drive. He may still drive a Cadillac next year, Perez is possible. He's maybe not the driver that I would pick. I would take Bottas over Perez, my opinion. You guys may disagree, but also there's other reasons for that. Perez has left the sport. He's not involved in Formula 1 anymore. Bottas still is reserve driver at Mercedes. He's effectively been coaching Kimi Antonelli. Bottas has made very clear his intentions to get back onto the grid. Great driver, multiple race winner. Excellent in terms of veteran leadership, helping to develop the car, stuff like that. Bottas will be very useful for. Would I take him over Perez? If money was no object, then yeah, I think I would. But of course, Perez does add the major implications of the money and the sponsorship for Mexico and the South American audience in general. I will say, a Bottas-Perez lineup, it's not what I would do, but I can see the logic behind it in the sense that the American fans may well love it, right? It would be massive for Cadillac to have Bottas, I think, with the implications of having a character like him in the team and then Perez. But is it what they're going to do? The question is, are Cadillac going to have one veteran, one more, let's just say, exciting driver, which is, I think, what I would like them to do, in which case Bottas and Perez are directly competing for that seat. There have also been some rumours that Perez could be, just because Alpine is such a mess, and who knows what Flavio Briatore is going to do. Alpine could be interested in Perez because maybe if Colapinto doesn't perform, it's like, well, you know, we could bring Perez back in. He maybe even brings more money than Colapinto does, more experience. You know, there's some things why that could have made a little bit of sense. But if Perez does want to come back, I think Cadillac would be very close to taking him. But according to the Motorsport article today, Bottas is now the new favourite for that seat, whereas it was previously Perez. As I say, they could still sign both, but it's very plausible they get one and they put somebody else in the car. We've heard about Drugovich potentially being a lethal option over there. It doesn't really feel like any of the Colton Herta options or, you know, let's say Marcus Armstrong and so on. I don't really think that's in the conversation so much. There has still been a bit of talk about Mick Schumacher, but yeah, Guan Yu Zhou is the other key option as well because of the Chinese implication there. So we'll see what time says, but I think it's been a pretty cool few weeks because it was only a couple of weeks ago where Perez was really considered to be the #1 chief favourite. Now it's looking more like Valtteri Bottas, and you can't blame him, right? I mean, it's very easy to forget how phenomenal a run Bottas had in Mercedes, 101 consecutive Q3 appearances when he was at the team. Quite the record and quite the driver. Now, is this man going to be quite the driver? We saw yesterday Arvid Lindblad, who will, as far as I'm aware anyway, be driving a Red Bull in Silverstone in the free practice sessions. He's only 17, but he's got a super license exemption, as we know, which allowed him to drive a Formula 1 car at Imola the other day, the 2023 AlphaTauri. Some numbers on that. He covered 300k. That's a Grand Prix distance. Completed 4 stints, 2 on the mediums, 2 on the soft. After the previous programs are completed, he made 3 starting tests. The team was apparently very satisfied with the test, according to Motorsport Italia. So pretty interesting stuff. It's just like when you're stepping into Formula 1, these are, if anything, these kind of practice runs, some of the hardest things you have to do as a driver, because In Formula 2, okay, you do some testing, but there's a real program here that teams want you to run to. You've got to do exactly what they want you to do for hours on ends, hitting exactly the type of lap times they're looking for, pushing in a certain way to see this, that, or the other with the car to try and so they can learn some things. You know, you are basically trying to be a robot to do what the team tells you to do because they've got a program to try and run through. That's something which is, you know, I think for some drivers relatively new because typically you get in the car, drive as fast as you can. Whereas when you're doing these type of tests, it's a bit of a different story. And I think in some respects, I imagine it requires a fair bit more concentration rather than just being like, oh yeah, well, I know how to drive and I know how to drive fast. But still, doing a race distance like this, apparently the team was very satisfied with maybe Arvid's feedback or whatever. You know, this kid's going to be in an F1 car next year. I have very little doubt about that. Vettel is not going to be, more than likely. Now, he has apparently held some talks with Red Bull, because there's been talk for some time whether Vettel, if Vettel, would come back into F1 in some capacity. Some would say he'd be a good FIA president. I think that he more than likely would be, but that's probably a little bit further down the pipeline. He could be a team principal for Red Bull or something, or at least be involved in the team in some capacity. But yes, apparently the talks are not yet so intense and in depth, but it's something where I can play a role in what form it will show. So apparently a potential Vettel return to Red Bull, at least in some capacity, some ambassadorial capacity. I think the community would like to see him more heavily involved in something F1 related. I think that will happen in due course, but doesn't seem like it's going to happen immediately. Just to quickly mention Oscar Piastri, there's not been many rumours on McLaren over the last few days other than the fact that Lando's excellent historically around the Austrian Grand Prix circuit. He didn't win the Grand Prix last year after crashing with Max. Russell inherited the win, as we full well know. Even the year before, this is one of the circuits where they brought an upgrade for the McLaren. All of a sudden, the McLaren was starting to look rather good. Oscar didn't get the upgrade in 2023 Austria, and maybe that was showing some of the difference. But I think it's pretty impressive how, if you look at Oscar's qualifying record, the worst he has been is fourth. He was fourth in Miami, but outside of that, even since then and even before, he's been third, bare minimum, right? Obviously a handful of pole positions, but this level of consistency in qualifying results has been unmatched on the grid so far, and if this continues, is undoubtedly going to be the reason why he wins this year's world title. Just the ice factor to deliver at least a lap that's good enough when it matters in qualifying, and then to execute on the point as well. It's just, if you're Lando, you're looking at some of these qualifying numbers, you're thinking, damn, not only have I got to out-qualify this guy, which is quite tough right now, I've then got to out-race him. Okay, let's say Russell wins the race. Lando finishes second, Oscar finishes third. You've gained a grand total of 3 points on your rival, right? So, you know, not to say that Max and George are going to keep winning races. Maybe Lando and Oscar keep trading a lot of wins and the McLaren kind of dominance continues from what we've seen in the season so far. But it's just, if you're Lando, you're looking at the title, you're thinking, okay, it's a 22-point gap. It's not like Lando will feel like it's over, but it's like, if Piastri's fourth or better every single weekends, it's going to be quite a lot to overcome that gap, right? Lando's going to have to improve substantially. I think he's there in some level, like the ability is there, as we know. We've seen it before, certainly around the Spielberg, you know, the track at Spielberg, the Red Bull Ring. But there's obviously more to it than that in terms of the execution of the weekends. Let's talk about some of the Ferrari stuff. The F1 movie premiere went down in London last night, and I'm going to watch this for the first time tomorrow. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about it, some of the reactions, some of the feedback. You know, I think I'm going in with the appropriate expectations. I'm sure some of you guys have seen it already, and I'm sure we'll, you know, have your thoughts on what you think about the realism factor or whatever. But I think, like, I don't know, I'm going to try and take it as it is, and just say, you know what, all right, let's just have a bit of fun with this film from a Formula 1 fan perspective. The fact that the drivers are going to be in it, I think it's going to be pretty cool. I'm actually looking forward to seeing it. I'm just not going to take it so seriously, because probably that's the right way to go about it. But yeah, Hamilton back at it again with his signature pregnant pose, which I always think is kind of funny. And Roscoe got a mention here in the credits. People were talking about, there was a couple of clips that were doing the rounds today online, people talking about the new film, and I thought it was pretty cool to see, to be fair. Apparently Alonso is the only man in the film, or the only driver in the film who has an actual line that he has. So I'll see if that's true. But Hamilton, of course, on the track, not been having the greatest time in the Ferrari. His last 12 Grand Prix have not gone to plan, let's say. You know, P4 in Imola, the best that he's really done since then. Abu Dhabi last year as well, of course, P4 then, but no podiums in the last 12 rounds for Hamilton. I think that's his longest streak that he's had without a podium in his career, which is, I think joint longest anyway, which is remarkable in terms of Hamilton's success, but equally goes to show that right now Hamilton, and mainly Ferrari really, are in a very challenging position. Toto defends Hamilton and says, look, when you're switching teams, you don't just lose your skill, everyone needs that period of adaptation, different car, different DNA, new engineering team, of course, joins a complete Italian team. There's lots of reasons why this was always going to be a challenging process, and I know that the pressure and the, let's say, scrutiny is on Hamilton, but you look at Carlos Sainz's season, he's had a very difficult time with respect to Albon for pretty much all of the year so far. He's getting there on occasion, but it's still not been great for Sainz by any means. I think he will, right about now, start to pick it up a little bit, but the drivers that have moved teams have struggled. Hamilton's far from an exception in that situation, but if the car was better, it would probably look a little bit different, right? And as we know, when the car was set up in a certain way, Hamilton was able to get pole with it back in China and convert that into a sprint win. But as we know, the other teams made some changes, they made some improvements for the Grand Prix. Ferrari weren't quite as competitive there, but even then they were still reasonably good. It's just Hamilton got disqualified because his floor was, well, effectively hitting the ground too much and the plank was wearing too much, and it felt like that issue. They made a slight tweak, I think, before the actual race under Parc Fermé, obviously Parc Fermé's broken between sprint and the race now, so they could make the change, which is what they did. It didn't seem to help things, and also he got disqualified for plank wear. And that's been, as soon as that happened, I think it was very evident that Ferrari had made a fundamental error with the setup of their car and the way that they designed it this year. It may have something to do with the suspension changes they made for this year's machine, and they are making adjustments to that in the near future. But this weekend, that is not expected to arrive in Austria, the changes to the rear suspension that have been heavily talked about, but there is at least one component of that upgrade package that will be arriving. As I say, when the disqualification in China happened, it was very clear that Ferrari had made a fundamental mistake because no other team was suffering with that really. We've seen a little bit of it from time to time this season. Every team is pushing the limits, but of the top teams, it's not an issue they really suffer from. The new development should reduce the car's reliance on lift and coast and allow for greater strategic freedom during races, particularly in terms of skid block wear. They're also expected to improve the overall balance of the car under high downforce conditions. The team hopes they will close the gap to direct rivals, especially on circuits where a greater setup compromise is required. So this is what Ferrari are now talking about. We knew they were going to bring something for this weekend. Fred Vasseur talked about it. That is now confirmed to be a completely new floor in Austria. So a big change. Not the major rear suspension change that we've been talking about. That apparently is going to come for Silverstone, but this is one piece of the major upgrades they plan to bring over the next couple of rounds. And this is what Rosario Giuliano describes here in the article that Auto Racer put together. The first block of upgrades in Styria, the new surface designed after the inconsistencies revealed in Australia. So, I mean, literally the first round of the season, they knew it was cooked and they knew that they needed to do something drastic. But it's taken a long time. I think that's the big question. That's Hamilton's question as well back in Canada. It was like, I don't really know why it's taken so long to get these upgrades. But they designed them a while ago. They took their time to bring them, and now they're going to bring them. But obviously some would say, okay, well, it's one change, right? They're not changing a load of components. It's maybe relatively minor. But no, the guys at Auto Racer say this is why calling it a minor upgrade is a mistake. This is a fundamental macro component with all the limitations of the mechanics from which it is difficult to extract further load at the end of the regulatory cycle. So, just great Formula One words. They're all put together in a beautiful sentence. But yeah, the feeling is that back in Melbourne, they realized that they had issues with their development this year in terms of, let's say, exploiting the aerodynamic loads. The upgrade arriving at the Red Bull Ring thus represents the first true attempt at a profound correction of the SF25 project after months of work within the walls of Maranello between technical meetings and choices on the budget to be allocated. That is also rather critical. In Austria, a new floor will debut that cannot be defined as a simple refinement. It is difficult to extract sudden miracles, but in Austria, a short track where a very compact group is expected, even a minimal gain will be fundamental, especially on Saturday. The new floor, I think is really what this is getting at, was described some time ago after its initial development in the tunnel. Bringing the healing parts to the track was unfeasible before June. In Canada, for logistical and setup reasons, it was actually not possible to bring the new parts, so much so that the new component was initially designed for Silverstone, a track that effectively will see loads of new upgrades for various different teams. But there were rumours they're going to have a new rear suspension as well, which presumably may still arrive for Silverstone, but this one is going to arrive in Austria. Its arrival one race early represents an effort by the technical department to speed up the recovery process. The Red Bull Ring package will not be a miracle, but, obviously they're expecting rather a lot. The reason why this upgrade arrived so late relative to the time it took to understand and correct the conceptual errors highlighted in the first races, Sarah and Tondi, top technical guys, had to work behind the scenes to set a new technical direction, more conservative but functional compared to the initial ambitions, which is, yeah, I mean, do you like the sound of that if you're a Ferrari fan? So they're basically saying, well, we had lofty hopes for this car and we tried this and it failed. So now we're going to try a version which is maybe not going to be quite the McLaren. I think that's basically the point of what Ferrari are saying, is that even if these upgrades work, they're not expecting to be the fastest. They're expecting to be second fastest if they work, I think. And maybe that's enough on certain weekends. And maybe that's fine in the sense that it was always a talking point. We mentioned it multiple times during the off-season. If McLaren brought upgrades that worked, like if McLaren's winter developments, if they took risk and those risks paid off, McLaren were always going to be unbeatable this year, realistically. Their car at the end of last season was the best, and if they took serious risks over winter, which they did, and seemingly every single risk they took was working as intended, it doesn't really seem to matter what other teams did. McLaren were uncatchable in some respects, and I think we've seen that so far this season. So maybe Ferrari making an upgrade that takes them a second, let's say a tenth of a second behind the McLarens and is the second fastest car, would be respectable given the circumstances, but the fact of the matter is they should have achieved that over the winter, you could argue, and maybe they should have been more functional and conservative with their upgrades over the winter rather than some of the changes they made, certainly to some of the suspension design concepts, which they changed radically for the final year here of the regulations. Changing to pull rod front suspension, of course, that was a major swap for the final year of the regs, and maybe if they hadn't done that and they were just taking a risk to say, okay, if McLaren nail it, then fair enough, they win, but if they don't quite nail it, then we're going to try and nail it without taking too much risk. Who knows? Maybe they should have done different decisions, let's say, in hindsight. But the delay in bringing developments was also a forced choice, children of past errors. These cars require stopping, understanding, and intervening wisely. So they say it took quite a long time for them to get on top of what these issues were and now bring some changes to try and correct them. But this is what the technical package is meant to do. Improve the balance of the car, reduce the reliance on lift and coast, gain better control over skid block wear. And I think these last two are rather connected. Leclerc gets told all the time on the radio, presumably Hamilton as well. Maybe Hamilton just does it and Leclerc doesn't want to or whatever. But towards the end of straights, the drivers often lift and coast a little bit, which is instead of having the accelerator press the whole time and then slamming the brakes, you lift the accelerator for a little bit and coast into the corner. Saves you a bit of fuel, saves you a little bit of tyres, but also saves your skid block, because at high speed, that's when the skid block is, closest to touching the ground. And if there's a small bump on the track, you will get that. Where we were sitting in the run between turn 9 and turn 10 in Canada, there was, you never really see this on the broadcast, but there was a little element of the track which was slightly bumpy, and as the cars were going over it, you could see where the skid blocks were wearing out on it. And it's the type of thing that if you lift and coast a little bit, then you can get away with the skid block wear. But it does seem to be a major issue. The way that they design that floor, the way they design the suspension, puts them in a position where having appropriate skid block wear so they don't get disqualified for the Grand Prix for running the car effectively too low, after China was a major issue. And I think after the win in China and then the disqualification in the main race after the sprint win, it was almost inevitable that Ferrari were never going to win anything else until they at least brought an upgrade, because every weekend they've had to make compromises in terms of their ride height to make sure their car doesn't destroy itself, basically, and get disqualified again. So, and even now, their reliance is like, well, okay, maybe we can run the car lower if we get our drivers to constantly lift and coast all the time, which slows down race pace, and it means that you're just, there's nothing more frustrating, I can't imagine, as a driver. You're trying to chase the guy in front, and the guy's on the radio saying, yeah, lift and coast, Charles, lift and coast. And it's like, well, you just settled me in for fourth at best, right? Which is nothing more frustrating, I don't imagine, than that. But this is meant to be the first true attempt at correcting the SF25. The question, I guess, is, should they have actually done it, right? Because, this is a major change, at least it is step one of a major series of changes in the next couple of rounds that Ferrari will certainly hope move them in the right direction. Maybe they've made the correct decision. Maybe the understanding that they've generated from these ground effect cars that is still going to be relevant next year if these upgrades on the SF25 work is relevant. But the point is, should they have used the development resources in this way? Should they have just ridden off this car and fully focused on next year? They decided not to. There was a big decision at some point made. Bring back some of the technical team working on 2026 to work instead on 2025. That's what they did. Now they're all back on 2026 again, right? Ever since these upgrades have been done and are simply in manufacturing, it's all been focused on 2026, but there was a period where Ferrari were making a sacrifice and they still refused to write off the entire season. Even Hamilton has apparently made the claim to the team, so the article said, that he would really prefer them to just fully focus on 2026. But clearly the team doesn't want to write this car off. Clearly they feel like there is more to come from this machine and maybe more understanding to come as well. So very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Just the final thing to mention, this is the forecast for the Austrian Grand Prix this weekend, and it's pretty toasty to say the least. FP1, FP2, we're talking 30-ish degrees. Back in Canada, it was pretty hot. It was maybe 26, 27, I don't know, something in that kind of ballpark, I would say, on race day, which is pretty hot, but it's not quite what it's expected to be in Austria. So yeah, more upgrades to Mercedes, but this is going to be a very telling weekend, I think, in terms of whether they've got on top of their tyre degradation issues in the heat, because yeah, if they haven't, it will be exposed right here, right now. So very much intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.